I'm a strange American in the sense that I'm as American as apple pie. Grew up in the Midwest, played baseball, with the cornfields behind the infield, and you know, but yet came from the Midwest, which has a very German influence and a German kind of town. Everyone in my school yearbook seemed to have a German last name, and through baseball, I was able to get some scholarships out to the East Coast and go to some fancy schools. Brown and at University of Michigan for law school and a master's at Harvard. So I studied the Constitution, I studied philosophy, I studied economics, I studied markets, I studied the laws and the values of our founding fathers, I studied sound money. A lot of those things that I studied, I kind of had to reevaluate in the last 15 or so years. But in the interim, I came from a German family. As I went to school in Germany, I worked at a German bank during the summers, married a beautiful French woman, raised my kids in France. So I'm an American with a German background, working in Zurich, living in France, and speaking in certain contexts in French too. But basically, I consider myself an American expat living overseas right now, but with a very global understanding, not just intellectually or theoretically, but the zeitgeist of being on the streets, from London to Zurich to Paris, certainly now, and Bordeaux or Frankfurt. There's a lot that's different and unique about each of these places, from Washington to Barcelona, but there's a lot that's very similar. And it's fascinating to get a kind of a voyeur's view of that from a personal perspective, but clearly on a financial perspective too. I get to see what people are thinking on the ground, and I get to talk to some fancy people who are making policies, good or bad, and I get to talk to really interesting, clever investors who have their own opinions. And between that whole mix, that whole Vermischung, melange, whatever you want to call it, I've derived some pretty strong convictions on what's working and not working, and what needs to be understood for everyone, whether they're in financial markets or not. I think it can be understood if a little bit of common sense, a little bit of effort, it can be understood. We're a Zurich-based operation that deals exclusively in physical precious metals, primarily gold and silver. We have our own in-house brokerage desk, our own storage facilities in an undisclosed location in the Swiss Alps, which is kind of like something you'd see in a James Bond movie, because we don't believe in holding gold in a commercial bank because of banking risk. Switzerland still has the best privacy, not perfect privacy, and the best neutrality, though not perfect neutrality. But we're really I joke all the time that I'm an insurance salesman and a landlord. I sell insurance, which is gold, because it's insurance against fiat money that's losing its purchasing power. And we can talk about why and how that's the case. And I'm a landlord because we charge a fee to hold that gold to sit in the ground and stare back at you. Our views on physical precious metals aren't about gold bulls or gold bugs. It's just our views on currency risk. And our views on currency risk stem from debt risk. And our debt risk comes from common sense and looking at the right data points. And again, without getting complex, we can talk about what debt means and what bonds mean and what yields mean, because it sounds all fancy. And markets, and I was a hedge fund manager during the dot-com bubble. I made some money. That's how I got into gold, because I'd made some of my own money and other people's money, and I wanted to invest it someplace safe as a insurance policy, as a preservation, not as a speculation asset. We could talk about that too, but my views on the markets and on debt had me pretty concerned years ago. And my partner, Egon von Greyerz, was way ahead of the curve with that and mentored me in that. And we can talk about that as well. But basically, I saw market risk, I saw banking risk, I saw debt risk, and all that led to currency risk. And currency risk, to me, one of the best hedges for me, it has been physical gold. There are other opinions, whether that's digital currencies or Bitcoins and Ethereums, or whether that's real estate, different types of real estate. There's different ways to look at the same problem. I just happen to have chosen physical gold as the solution. But I think the main problem, Ivor, is debt. And we can talk about why that is and get into that if you'd like. I think the best way is kind of start at 30,000 feet and come down into specifics. And, I'll say I was joking or talking about my youth in America, and I came from this town called Stevensville, Michigan, in the Midwest, which was, school Monday through Friday, sports on Saturday, church on Sunday, and real kind of conservative, wonderful, great piece of Americana. But in that town was a fellow named David Stockman, who became a budget manager for Ronald Reagan, and he was kind of a hero of our town. And years later, he became, I think, one of the most blunt and honest speakers about debt and central bank policy to solve debt. His named David Stockman. He wrote a great book that I recommend anyone look at. It's called The Great Deformation. There are some key books that I think are really worth reading. And David Stockman, even when I was in law school or as an undergrad, I still was looking at what he was doing and saying. And he got me thinking about debt, and he understood debt and these fantasy solutions to the debt. In a lot of ways, it's just like any family or any couple or any common sense group that sits around a table at dinner or at lunch and says, honey, this is what we're making this year. These are our bills. This is what the kids need. These are the expenses. Can we do it or can we not do it? And if we can't do it, do we have to get better jobs, make more income, or do we have to cut some spending? Do we have to sell the Volkswagen or the Porsche or whatever it is to put our kids through school? Do we cancel that vacation to Hilton Head next weekend? Or do we look for better jobs to make more income? In other words, when you're facing basic common sense balance sheets in your own personal life, you either have to make more, GDP yourself, you have to produce more, or you have to be spending less. And governments, you'd think, would behave in the same way. Obviously, some leverage, some loans, like mortgages or car loans, are part of life. Some debt is part of life. But when you take that to an extreme of multiples that are beyond rational to abstractions, you have a real problem. I say if you have a busboy salary but a Ferrari appetite, you're going to have a mismatch. That's common sense. And you'd think that would be common sense to the central banks or to the inhabitants of the White House, be they left, right, or center, or the budget offices of any administration. You'd think that would be common sense. But the simple truth is, when you're a government and you're a president or a senator that wants to get reelected, you need to spend more. You need to have more money available to buy votes, buy popularity, buy a good print, so to speak, in the economy. You can fake it by going into debt. And Stockman years ago saw this long before COVID or Putin became the excuse for our inflation or our debt problems. He said our country's going into debt at rapid speed. 33 trillion is an abstraction. You have to understand that when Volcker was our Fed chair and not Powell, public debt was under 900 billion. Now we're at 33 trillion. That's a massive amount of debt in a short period of time. But our income, our productivity hasn't grown at the same pace. Whether you measure that by GDP or you measure it by even tax receipts, that's down year over year. So our country, like a family, has a busboy salary, but a Ferrari appetite. And the debt levels that we're at now are extraordinary. And where it gets weird is when you talk about, well, how does a government get to that much debt? Well, usually because it's to stay elected or to stay popular. And how do we pay for that debt? Well, we, like anyone else, we issue IOUs. Those are called U.S. Treasuries, and the world buys those. But lately, the world's buying less of those because we have so many of them that no one trusts our IOUs. Just like you wouldn't keep lending to a friend who's constantly borrowing and never paying you back, or paying you back at a level that's below what you would need to beat inflation. But the other trick, the most astounding trick, is the Federal Reserve. And again, this is very simple, but if your country's in debt and there's a lot of IOUs out there that no one wants, well, how do you pay for that debt, or how do you cover that debt? Well, you can literally mouse click that money at a place called the Eccles Building on Constitutional Ave at the Federal Reserve. There's a lot of things that are problematic with the Federal Reserve. First, it's neither federal nor reserve. It's an independent private bank. It's not part of the government. It's on Constitution Ave in Washington, D.C., although our Constitution doesn't actually allow a private bank to control the printing or coinage of our money. So there's a lot of problems with the central bank. There's another great book called The Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffin. It's a classic. Again, you have to read it to believe it. And I won't get into all the permutations and kind of Tom Clancy-like mechanizations behind the central bank, but it's a beast. It's literally a creature. But that central bank has a machine, literally like a computer, like a laptop. It's not a money printer. It doesn't actually print dollars and bills out in the basement. You just mouse click. You need a couple more dollars, just mouse click them. And again, if you or I or your family had a machine in the basement where you could go downstairs, log on, your checking account says you have $1,000, but you say, you know what, I'd like a few more zeros on that checking account. Let's make it 100,000. Let's make it 1 million. Let's make it 10 million. And you could do that legally, expand your money supply legally to cover your debts. You'd be a genius. But that's actually against the law. It's counterfeit. But that's exactly what our central bank does.